So we've got Eddie Hearn running around saying that this Matchroom versus Queensberry 5v5 is the best card in boxing history. And while it is a great card without a shadow of a doubt, it doesn't even come close to being the best card in boxing history, and Eddie Hearn knows it. We're from the same generation. He grew up watching the exact same cards that I did. He remembers all the old Don King cards just as well as I do. And look, I get it. He's a promoter. He's doing what he's paid to do, which is hype it up. But in the process of doing so, he's obviously going to mislead a lot of casual fans who don't know any better. Well, I do know better. So in this video, I'm going to give you a few examples of fight cards that I remember from back in the days, which were at least as good as this one at a bare minimum, and in some cases, much, much better. But before I get to that, I just want to touch on some of the responses I got to the review of the press conference I did yesterday. I had quite a few casuals and snowflakes leaving comments, which always make for a baffling read. A lot of them didn't understand the concept of a review. They seem to think that a review should only contain praise and not criticism, which is totally bizarre. And even more bizarre than that were the people who accused me of being negative about the fight card itself, when I literally called it a great card several times in the video and said how much I was looking forward to it. I said literally nothing negative about the card whatsoever. Not one thing. All I did was praise it. All I was critical of was the press conference, which is something different entirely. And if you think I shouldn't be critical of a press conference, then you have absolutely no concept of what a boxing press conference is actually for. So let me hold your hand and walk you through it. A boxing press conference is designed as a piece of theater to generate public interest in a fight card. It's meant to be enjoyable to watch. It's designed to be entertaining. That's why they do face-offs. That's why they let the fighters trash talk each other. That's why in this case, they made a trailer. It's all for public consumption. And as a consumer, I'm going to tell you whether the press conference had the desired effect on me, and it didn't. In a nutshell, I thought they let the presenters and promoters do far too much talking and didn't let the actual fighters talk anywhere near enough. Now, not all the fighters really wanted to talk, but some of them did. They just weren't given much opportunity. The presenters kept constantly butting in. They didn't allow anything to flow. They tried a new format and it just didn't work. The traditional press conference format works better than that. Now, let's get onto these old fight cards. In fact, there was one guy in the comments of yesterday's video who was upset with the fact that I said Beterbiev versus Bivol is not the greatest card in history. A grown man literally behaving like a 12-year-old girl when someone tells her that Justin Bieber isn't the greatest singer in history. Jesus wept. This channel is not a safe space, sweetheart. You gotta put your big boy pants on over here. Anyway, let's put all the hype aside and look at this June 1st card in the cold light of day. Number 1, Beterbiev versus Bivol, top of the bill. The two biggest names in the division, both unbeaten, long-reigning, future Hall of Famers, squaring off for undisputed at 175. Great fight, historic fight, absolutely love it. Number 2, Wilder versus Zhang. There's intrigue in this one because these are two of the biggest punchers in the heavyweight division. So there's the possibility of thrills and spills, which is what we're all hoping for. But if we're gonna put this fight in its proper context, both currently and historically, this is one big name who's over the hill against a semi-big name in a non-title fight. Wilder's 38 and Zhang's 40. They're both coming off losses in extremely boring fights. Wilder isn't ranked in the top 5 of any of the sanctioning bodies, and Zhang's only ranked in the top 5 by one of them. So yes, we're all intrigued, but let's put this fight into perspective in terms of its significance. Number 3, Daniel Dubois versus Filip Hrgović. As it stands right now, this is a non-title fight between two semi-well-known contenders. They're both in their prime or close to it, but so far, neither of them is proven at world level. Dubois has already got 2 losses, and other than Zhang, Hrgović really hasn't fought anyone. So it's a good fight. It might turn out to be the show stealer, but it isn't one of the top 5 biggest fights in the heavyweight division. And as it stands right now, at least, it doesn't carry any historical significance. The remaining bouts on this card are all trade fights, meaning unless you're a really hardcore boxing fan, you'll probably have no idea who any of these guys are. Doesn't mean these fights won't be entertaining, but I'm just providing some context. So, number 4, Ray Ford versus Nick Ball. This is the only other world title fight on the entire card. Ford is a newly crowned champion who won the title by the skin of his teeth, and he's going up against the guy in Nick Ball who's coming off a close defeat in his first world title tilt. It's an intriguing style matchup. Both young guys, both still relatively unproven at the highest level. Number 5, Hamza Shiraz versus Ammo Williams. Two young, unbeaten contenders squaring off in a non-title fight. Intriguing style matchup. And alongside Hrgovic Dubois, I think this has the highest chance of being the show stealer, as far as undercard fights at least. But both of these guys are unproven. Neither of them have beat anyone of note. As it stands right now, this fight is of no historical significance. Number 6, Craig Richards versus Willie Hutchinson. It's a decent fight between two fringe contenders in a non-title bout. If it weren't on this card, it might headline the York Hall and sell a few hundred tickets. Certainly wouldn't come close to selling out a big arena. Again, it might turn out to be very entertaining. I hope it does. But there's loads of entertaining trade fights that happen every single month that don't get any fanfare at all. As I said, context. So let's compare this card to a few that I remember from back in the day. We'll start off light, something that isn't too stacked. Mike Tyson versus Razor Ruddock back in 1991. Starting from the top of the bill. Number 1, Tyson versus Ruddock. Final eliminator for the world heavyweight title. You've got one guy in Mike Tyson who's already at this stage a certified Hall of Famer, youngest heavyweight champion of all time, one of the most popular fighters in history, probably the most exciting heavyweight that ever lived, and at this point of his career, a former undisputed champion with just one defeat, still in his mid-20s, going up against the hottest contender in the world at the time, other than himself, in Razor Ruddock. Two massive punchers, both young, both hyper-aggressive, turned out to be a fantastic heavyweight slugfest, exactly as we all expected. Number 2 on the card, Simon Brown versus Maurice Blocker. WBC and IBF welterweight unification. Fantastic matchup. Brown is one of the greatest Jamaican fighters of all time. Two-weight world champion, famously knocked out Terry Norris at 154, actually got iced himself a few fights later by Vincent Petaway in one of the wildest knockouts you'll ever see. Go look that one up. But anyway, IBF welterweight champion Simon Brown unifying with WBC champion Maurice Blocker. Blocker was a big, tall welterweight, previously beat the original Magic Man, Marlon Starling, for the WBC title. Number 3 on the card, Julio Cesar Chavez versus John Duplessis. Unified WBC and IBF super lightweight titles, or light welterweight as it was then. Chavez, well, do we even need to say anything about him? One of the greatest fighters in history. 73-0 at the time of this fight. Yes, 73-0. Defending his belts against John Duplessis, who was 36-1 at the time. Both guys were in their 20s. Number 4 on the card, Roberto Duran versus Pat Lawler. Duran, again, one of the greatest fighters in history. Multi-weight world champion, a legend in the game. He was past his prime at this point, coming off a points defeat to Sugar Ray Leonard in their trilogy fight, but still a massive name. And this turned out to be a massive upset because Pat Lawler actually won. The remaining 3 bouts on this card were all standard fare, but they still featured some notable fighters. Greg Page, former world heavyweight champion, Bernard Hopkins, who went on to become a Hall of Famer, and Justin Duco, who went on to challenge for world titles against Floyd Mayweather and Diego Corrales. All right, next card. Lennox Lewis versus Tony Tucker, May 1993. Top of the bill, Lewis versus Tucker, WBC heavyweight title. Lennox Lewis, one of the greatest heavyweights in history, WBC champion at the time, his first reign. Tucker was the former IBF champion, only one loss on his record at this stage, a points defeat to Mike Tyson, the only man to ever take Mike Tyson the distance in a world title fight. Number 2 on the card, Gerald McClellan versus Julian Jackson. WBC middleweight title. Two of the greatest punchers, pound for pound, in boxing history. And it turned out to be one of the greatest slugfests in middleweight history. It was the Hagler Hearns of its day. Jackson was the long reigning champion. McClellan was the challenger. The knockout was absolutely brutal. If you want to see someone launch a right hand, literally like a javelin, throwing their whole body into it, go look at the first knockdown. And he followed it up with a left hook that damn near took his head clean off. Dear oh dear, Absolutely brutal. Legendary, historic fight between two legendary fighters. Number 3 on the card, Julio Cesar Chavez defended his 140-pound title against Terence Ali. You also had Meldrick Taylor on the card and Hector Camacho, literally stacked with Hall of Famers. Next card, January 1994, top of the bill, the legendary first fight between Julio Cesar Chavez and the surgeon Frankie Randall for the WBC title at 140 pounds. This was not only Chavez's first defeat, he was 89-0 at the time. Everyone thought he was going to get to 100-0, but it was also the first time he'd ever been knocked down in a professional fight, which is absolutely crazy considering the number of fights he'd had by this point. I remember this fight like it was yesterday. Frankie Randall was actually my older brother's favorite fighter back then. Well, actually, Frankie Randall and Evander Holyfield, they were his two favorites. But yeah, legendary fight, historic fight between these two. What more can I say? Number 2 on the card, Felix Trinidad versus Hector Camacho for the IBF title at 147 pounds. Two legends of the game, Hall of Famers. This was a passing of the torch fight between two of the best Puerto Rican fighters in history. Camacho was 43-2. That was his record. Trinidad was 22-0. It was the natural matchup to make. Number 3 on the card, Simon Brown versus Troy Waters, IBF light middleweight title. Brown defending against the tough Aussie contender. Waters really got this fight off the back of the wild slugfest he had with Terry Norris. He dropped Norris in that fight and hurt him several times. So after Brown knocked Norris out a couple fights later, they brought Waters back in to challenge for the title again. Also on the card, you had Tommy Hearns, legend, Meldrick Taylor, legend, and Razor Ruddock. Next card, May 1994. The rematch between Julio Cesar Chavez and Frankie Randall. WBC light welterweight title. Absolutely huge. Number 2 on the card, the rematch between Gerald McClellan and Julian Jackson. WBC middleweight title. Number 3 on the card, Azuma Nelson versus Jesse James Lehar. WBC featherweight title. The Professor, Hall of Famer, 3-weight world champion, one of the top 2 African fighters to ever do it. It's between him and Dick Tiger, taking on Jesse James in their second fight. If you don't know, you better get to know. Number 4 on the card, Simon Brown versus Terry Norris rematch. Number 5 on the card, Ricardo Lopez versus Kerman Guardia, WBC strawweight title. Finito Lopez. Yeah, they called him Finito because that's what happened when you stepped in the ring with this guy. You finished. Monster puncher. Retired undefeated, 51-0. One of the top 3 Mexican fighters in history. You can't chat to this guy. We're 5 world title fights deep on this card, and every single one of them is Hall of Famers. How many world title fights are in the June 1st card? 2? Bro, don't get me mad. I swear some of you casuals and Johnny-come-latelys are going to get me vexed with your foolish comments. On top of the 5 Hall of Fame world title fights on this card, you also had Meldrick Taylor and Christy Martin. And in fact, let me just say something about Christy Martin. Christy Martin in her prime was, without a shadow of a doubt, the greatest puncher in female boxing history. Never mind later on in her career when she was fighting girls who were much bigger than her. When she was in her prime, fighting girls her own size, the quality and technique of her power punching was better than any female fighter I've ever seen in my entire life. Forget Layla Ali and Ann Wolfe, they were just big. They weren't actually any good as far as technique. Christy Martin was legitimately good, and she could seriously punch. She was naturally a lightweight really, but she had to go all the way up to super middleweight because nobody her own size could live with her. Anyway, next card, September 94. Julio Cesar Chavez versus Meldrick Taylor rematch, WBC title at 140. First fight was incredibly controversial. Number 2 on the card, Frankie Randall versus Juan Martin Koji, WBA title at 140. Koji was a long-reigning champion from Argentina, very awkward southpaw, good puncher. Both guys went down in the fight. Well worth a watch. Number 3, Felix Trinidad versus Luis Campas, IBF title at 147. Trinidad, an undefeated young champion. Campas, aka Yuri Boy, an undefeated challenger from Mexico, 56-0 going into the fight. Pressure fighter, great left hook, dropped Trinidad in the second round, went on to have a run as world champion at 154. Number 4 on the card, Gabriel Ruelas versus Jesse James Lehar, WBC featherweight title. Gabriel was one half of the Ruelas brothers, the other half being Rafael, both trained by Joe Goosen. And Jesse James was a tough hombre, beat Azuma Nelson. Number 5 on the card, Vincent Petway versus Gianfranco Rossi, WBC light middleweight title, the rematch. First fight ended in controversy. Rossi, a long-reigning champion from Italy, Petway went in there and gave him those hands with no controversy this time. And the new. Number 6, Ricardo Lopez defended his WBC strawweight title again. Are you counting these world title fights on this card? Because you should be. That's 6 on the one card, all right? Also had fearless Freddie Pendleton lower down on the show, one of the old school road warriors from back in the days. Have gloves, will travel. Next card, December 1994, Julio Cesar Chavez versus Tony Lopez, WBC World Lightweight title top of the bill. Chavez the legend, Lopez former 2-weight world champion. Number 2 on the bill, IBF world title, Felix Trinidad versus unbeaten contender Obakar. Great fight, both guys down. Number 3, Jorge Castro versus John David Jackson, WBA middleweight title. Incredible fight. If you ain't seen this fight, go add it to your watch list on YouTube right now. Number 4 on the card, WBA light welterweight title, Frankie Randall versus Rodney Moore. Number 5 on the card, Finito Lopez versus Yamil Carballo, WBC strawweight title. Bro, we're 5 world title fights deep again on one card, stacked with Hall of Famers and legends. You had Tony Tucker and Maurice Blocker on that card as well. Are you starting to get the picture here? Next card, November the 9th, 96, Tyson Holyfield won. Now, let me just say something here. There was some casual masquerading as a hardcore boxing fan, God bless him, who left a comment on my last video saying that he'd had a look at this card on boxrec and came to the conclusion that it was decidedly average. Decidedly average? Jesus wept. Forgive them, Lord, they know not what they do. See, this is probably one of those guys who actually takes the boxrec star rating system seriously. Looks at a fight and it's only got 2 or 3 stars and says, well, that fight can't have been any good then. It's only got 3 stars on boxrec. Let me show you how god-awful and totally irrelevant the boxrec rating system is with today's fighters. Never mind fighters who were active decades before boxrec existed, who they've retroactively rated. Chris Eubank Jr. is ranked higher in the boxrec pound-for-pound rankings than Alexander Usyk, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Isaac Cruz, Teofimo Lopez, Janabek Alim Kanuli, and many others. And you're taking their rating system seriously? People, I'm not making this up. Go look for yourselves. Ryan Garcia is ranked higher than Alexander Usyk pound for pound on boxrec. Do you feel silly yet? The boxrec star ratings for fighters and fights is based on an entirely computerized system, which is horribly flawed. This has been known for years. So if you're judging what a good fight is or a good card is purely based on this, you're going to be totally clueless. If you weren't around when certain cards took place, you cannot rely on the boxrec star ratings to tell you how good they were. You're going to have to go and watch the actual fights and read the old news articles. There's no shortcut to becoming a knowledgeable boxing fan. Anyway, top of the bill, Tyson Holyfield won, WBA title. Do I even need to say anything about this legendary fight or the legendary status of these two fighters? On the undercard, Michael Moorer versus Francois Botha, IBF heavyweight title. Brutal fight, brutal ending. Henry Akinwande versus Alexander Zolkin, WBO heavyweight title. Another brutal fight. Akinwande turned Zolkin's forehead into a bloody pulp. Just kept cracking him on the same spot over and over with those bony Nigerian knuckles. During his career, Akinwande obviously fought people like Lennox Lewis, Oliver McCall, and even John Fury. Knocked poor John Fury out in a couple rounds. But it was Alexander Zolkin who had to feel the pain on this card for the WBO heavyweight title. 3 world heavyweight title fights on one card, all ending in brutal late stoppages. And this guy calls it decidedly average. You couldn't make it up. We'll keep going. On the same card was Antonio Cimino defended his WBC Super Bantamweight title. And of course, the ever-prolific Finito Lopez defended his WBC strawweight strap, or minimum weight as they call it today. You also had Christy Martin and even Scott Welch further down the bill. And we'll finish just as we started, with a light one, something a little less stacked, but still very strong. November 1999, the rematch between Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield. Undisputed heavyweight title. 4 world title fights on this card in total. Lewis Holyfield top of the bill, obviously. Historic fight between legends. Fabrice Tiozzo defending his WBA cruiserweight title against Ken Murphy was also on this card. Tiozzo, for those of you who don't know, is one of the greatest French fighters of all time. 2-weight world champion, beat people like Mike McCallum, Eric Lucas, Nate Miller, and Dariusz Michalczewski, who was a very underrated light heavyweight champion from back in the days. You also had Shambe Mitchell versus Elio Ortiz fighting for the WBA light welterweight title on the card. Mitchell, of course, won his belt from Khalid Railu, the guy who stopped Frankie Randall in a big upset. And finally, Stefano Zoff versus Gilberto Serrano, WBA lightweight title. So there you have it. Just a tiny handful of cards from back in the 1990s. There were many, many, many more which were equally stacked and even more so. And you can go all the way back to the 80s and 70s and beyond. The idea that June 1st, 2024 is the greatest card of all time is nothing but Eddie Hearn hyperbole. The type of thing that only the most naive casual would ever believe. Again, it's still a great card. I'm certainly not complaining about it. I love it. But I think it's important for veteran boxing fans such as myself to provide context to some of the things that these promoters say. What the Saudis are doing is fantastic for boxing, but the quality of these cards is not unprecedented. So let's not get blinded by promoter hype talk here or recency bias. June 1st is a great card, a historic fight top of the bill, both guys in their 30s. Beterbiev, I think, is 40 now. On the undercard, there's no all-time greats, only one other world title fight, plenty of 50-50s, yes. Mostly between unproven contenders. In the case of Wilder Zhang, an over-the-hill ex-champion against a 40-year-old Chinaman. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping we see a devastating knockout. But let's just look at this in the cold light of day, all right? That's all I'm saying. So we don't get carried away. We need to put this show in its correct historical context, all right? Class dismissed. And before I go, I want to give a shout out to all the new subscribers to my Patreon page. I cover loads of different topics in my weekly podcast, as you can see on screen right now, from current events to deep dives down the rabbit hole and everything in between. I'm really enjoying the feedback and the discussions we've been having on there lately. So if you'd like to join the conversation, just click the link in the description box below. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.